Gary was already sitting down when Rex walked in with the map. Rex had not even asked the question yet. Gary just pointed at the chair. He had seen this look on Rex's face before. Rex sat down and pointed at a long thin island in the Caribbean. He asked why it was still poor after all these years. Gary exhaled slowly. This one had a lot of layers. Chapter 1. The island that had everything. Before 1959, Cuba was one of the more developed countries in Latin America. It had the fourth highest income per person in the region. Havana had more cars per capita than most of Europe at the time. The island exported huge amounts of sugar, and American companies owned much of the land that grew it. Rex looked at old photos. Casinos. Hotels. A booming capital city. But that wealth was extremely unequal. A small elite controlled most of the land and most of the money. Rural Cuba, where most people actually lived, had high illiteracy, poor healthcare, and almost no infrastructure. American businesses controlled large portions of the sugar industry, the utilities, and the banking sector. The government at the time was led by Fulgencio Batista, a dictator who came to power through a military coup. Batista's government was widely seen as corrupt, repressive, and closely tied to American business interests and organized crime networks running Havana's casinos. Gary explained that the shiny version of Cuba that shows up in old postcards was real for some dinosaurs and completely invisible for most of them. Rex understood. This sounded familiar from another island they had talked about before. Chapter 2. The Revolution that Promised Everything. In 1959, a group of revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro overthrew Batista. The promise was simple. Land reform. Education. Healthcare. An end to foreign domination of the economy. In the early years, the new government nationalized land, redistributed it to farmers, and launched massive literacy and healthcare campaigns. These campaigns were genuinely effective. Cuba's literacy rate jumped dramatically within a few years. Infant mortality dropped. Life expectancy rose. These are not propaganda numbers. International health organizations confirm them. Rex was surprised. He had expected this chapter to be simpler than it turned out to be. But the government also nationalized nearly all private businesses, including ones owned by American companies, without full compensation. This included sugar mills, oil refineries, factories, and large amounts of land. The Cuban government also moved quickly toward a one-party political system, restricting independent press, opposition parties, and many civil liberties. Thousands of Cubans, including much of the educated professional class, left the island in the early 1960s. Doctors, engineers, businesspeople. A wave of departures that would repeat again and again over the following decades. Gary called this the second time the brain drain pattern had shown up in one of their stories. Chapter 3. The wall goes up around the island. The nationalization of American-owned businesses without compensation triggered a sharp response from the United States. Beginning in 1960, the U.S. imposed a series of escalating trade restrictions on Cuba. By 1962, this became a near-total trade embargo, which is still in effect in some form today, over 60 years later. The embargo restricted Cuban access to American markets, American technology, and American financial systems. Because the United States economy was so large and so central to global trade, the embargo had ripple effects well beyond direct trade between the two countries. Many international companies with U.S. business interests avoided trading with Cuba entirely, fearing penalties. Rex asked if this alone explained everything. Gary said no. It was a major piece. But only one piece. Economists disagree, sometimes strongly, on how much of Cuba's economic struggle comes from the embargo versus from the Cuban government's own economic policies. Cuban officials have long pointed to the embargo as the primary cause of the island's poverty. Independent economists, including some sympathetic to the Cuban government, generally agree the embargo caused real damage, but argue it does not fully explain Cuba's economic performance compared to other countries that also faced sanctions or isolation but grew faster. This is one of the most contested questions in modern economic history. Rex did not get a clean answer, because there is not one. Chapter 4. The Soviet Lifeline. For nearly 30 years, Cuba's economy survived largely because of the Soviet Union. The USSR bought Cuban sugar at prices far above the world market rate. In exchange, the Soviets sent Cuba cheap oil, machinery, food, and billions of dollars in subsidies every year. This relationship effectively replaced the trade Cuba had lost with the United States. It also meant Cuba's economy became heavily dependent on a single foreign patron, rather than developing a diversified economy of its own. Rex thought this sounded like trading one kind of dependency for another. Gary said that was exactly the right way to think about it. For decades, this arrangement kept Cuba's economy functioning, even if inefficiently. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The subsidies stopped almost overnight. Chapter 5. The Special Period. What followed is known in Cuba as the Special Period in peacetime. It was, by most measures, an economic catastrophe. Cuba's economy shrank by an estimated 35% in just a few years. Oil imports collapsed. Factories shut down for lack of fuel and parts. Food shortages became severe. Average caloric intake for ordinary Cubans dropped sharply. Cubans across the island improvised. Bicycles replaced cars. Urban gardens replaced supermarket produce. The government opened limited spaces for small private enterprise and tourism, partly out of necessity. This period is critical to understanding modern Cuba, because it shows how dependent the entire system had become on Soviet support, and how fragile the underlying economy actually was without it. Rex asked why the government did not simply open up the economy more after this crisis, the way some other former communist countries did. Gary said this is where the story gets political, and where reasonable people disagree sharply. Chapter 6. The system itself. Cuba maintains a centrally planned economy, where the state controls most major industries, sets most prices, and pays most salaries directly. State employees, including doctors and engineers, often earn the equivalent of a few dollars a month in official wages. This created a strange and persistent problem. A taxi driver earning tips from tourists can often out-earn a surgeon. This mismatch pushes skilled workers out of the professions Cuba trained them for, and toward informal or tourism-related work instead. Cuba also maintains two different currency systems for much of its modern history, creating confusing and distorted prices across the economy. Critics of the Cuban government argue these structural choices, not just the embargo, are central to why the economy has struggled to grow even in periods when external pressure eased somewhat. Defenders of the government argue that any economic opening has been deliberately constrained by the ongoing embargo, which limits investment, technology, and financial access regardless of internal policy. Both of these things can be true at the same time. External pressure can be severe, and internal economic structure can also be a major constraint. Rex found this frustrating. He wanted one cause. Gary reminded him that this had happened before too. Chapter 7. Tightening and loosening, over and over. U.S.-Cuba relations have not stayed static for 60 years. They have moved back and forth multiple times. In the 1990s, under pressure from the post-Soviet collapse, Cuba allowed limited foreign investment, especially in tourism. In the 2000s, Venezuela became a new patron, providing Cuba with subsidized oil in exchange for Cuban doctors working in Venezuelan communities. Once again, Cuba's economy leaned heavily on one foreign benefactor. In 2014 and 2015, the United States and Cuba began a historic diplomatic thaw under President Obama, restoring some travel and trade. Embassies reopened. Direct flights resumed. American visitors increased significantly. Then, starting in 2017, U.S. policy reversed again, reinstating many restrictions. Each shift in policy created and then erased opportunities for the Cuban economy to grow, making long-term planning extremely difficult for businesses and households alike. Rex noticed a pattern. Every time Cuba's economy started to stabilize around one source of support, that source eventually disappeared, and the island had to absorb the shock again. Chapter 8. Venezuela falls too. By the mid-2010s, Venezuela itself fell into a severe economic and political crisis. Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba dropped sharply. This removed yet another external support Cuba had come to rely on. Combined with continued U.S. sanctions, tightened further during this period, Cuba experienced renewed fuel shortages, blackouts, and food scarcity in the following years. The COVID-19 pandemic then devastated Cuba's tourism industry, one of the few sectors generating foreign currency for the island. By 2021, Cuba faced its worst economic crisis since the special period of the 1990s. Mass protests broke out across the island in July of that year, the largest in decades, driven by shortages of food, medicine, and electricity. Rex asked if anything had actually improved by this point. Gary said modestly, in some areas, and severely not in others. Chapter 9. What the data actually shows. Cuba's healthcare and education systems remain genuinely strong by many measures, even compared to wealthier countries. Life expectancy in Cuba is similar to that in the United States, despite Cuba having a fraction of the resources. Literacy rates remain among the highest in the world. These are real achievements, and most economists, regardless of political viewpoint, acknowledge them. But average income, access to consumer goods, internet connectivity, and overall economic growth remain far behind most of Latin America. GDP per capita in Cuba is difficult to measure precisely because of the dual currency system and limited transparency, but most independent estimates place it well below regional averages. So Cuba presents an unusual picture. Strong outcomes in health and education. Weak outcomes in income and material living standards. Rex said this did not fit neatly into the story he expected. Gary said most real stories do not. Chapter 10. The company nobody talks about. Rex asked Gary one more question before they finished. He asked who actually controls most of the businesses ordinary Cubans interact with every day. Gary said the answer was a name most tourists never hear. GAESA. The full name is Grupo de Administración Empresarial, S.A. A military-run business conglomerate. It began in the late 1980s and early 1990s as a way for the Cuban armed forces to manage a small number of state companies. Over the following decades, it grew into something much larger. Today, GAESA controls a massive share of the formal Cuban economy. It runs most of the hotels foreign tourists stay in, through subsidiaries that manage joint ventures with international hotel chains. It controls gas stations, retail stores, shipping ports, real estate development, and the dollar stores where Cubans buy basic goods using foreign currency. It even controls a significant portion of the financial system that handles remittances sent from Cubans abroad back to their families on the island. Rex asked how a military organization ended up running hotels and gas stations. Gary explained that this was not an accident. It was a deliberate strategy. When the Soviet subsidies collapsed in the early 1990s, the Cuban government needed a way to generate hard currency quickly. Tourism was the most obvious opportunity. The military already had organizational structure, internal discipline, and access to capital that civilian state enterprises did not. So the government handed major sectors of the economy to military-run companies instead of opening them to broader private enterprise or even to other parts of the civilian state. Over time, GAESA absorbed more and more of the profitable parts of the economy. Estimates vary, because GAESA does not publish detailed financial reports, but many economists and Cuba researchers believe it controls somewhere between 60 and 80% of the island's foreign currency earnings. Rex found this number difficult to process. Almost the entire flow of dollars and euros into the country passes through one organization tied to the military. Gary said this creates a strange and important contradiction at the center of the Cuban economic story. On one hand, the government blames the U.S. embargo for the island's poverty, and the embargo is real and does cause real damage. On the other hand, much of the foreign currency that does enter the country, from tourism, from joint ventures, from remittances, gets funneled through GAESA rather than reaching ordinary Cuban households or being reinvested in public services in a transparent way. Small private businesses, the limited ones the government allows to exist, often have to operate in the shadow of GAESA-controlled supply chains. A small restaurant owner might need fuel, building materials, or imported ingredients. Many of those supply chains run through GAESA-affiliated companies, sometimes at prices and terms the small business has little power to negotiate. This means that even when the Cuban government loosens restrictions and allows more private enterprise, as it did more significantly starting in 2021, the playing field is not fully open. One enormous, opaque, military-linked conglomerate sits at the center of nearly every supply chain that matters. Rex asked why this was not more widely discussed when people talked about Cuba's economy. Gary said part of the reason is that GAESA itself operates with very little public transparency. It does not release detailed earnings reports the way a public company would. Cuban citizens themselves often have limited visibility into exactly how much money flows through it or where the profits ultimately go. Some economists and Cuba analysts argue that GAESA functions less like a normal state enterprise and more like a parallel economy, one that captures the profitable, foreign currency-generating parts of Cuban commerce while leaving the peso-based economy, the one most ordinary Cubans actually live inside, chronically underfunded. This helps explain something that had puzzled Rex earlier. Why does a country with respected doctors and high literacy still struggle so badly with food shortages, blackouts, and crumbling infrastructure? Part of the answer is the embargo. Part of the answer is decades of centralized economic planning. And part of the answer is that a large share of whatever foreign currency does make it into the country gets concentrated inside one institution that average Cubans have very little visibility into and almost no influence over. Gary said this was not a uniquely Cuban problem. Many countries, regardless of their political system, end up with a small number of powerful institutions controlling a disproportionate share of national wealth. But in Cuba's case, the scale of GAESA's control over the formal economy, combined with the lack of public transparency, made it a significant piece of the puzzle that often gets left out of simpler explanations involving only the embargo or only the revolution. Chapter 11. The answer Rex did not want, again. Rex wanted one clean cause, the way he always did. There was not one. There was a deeply unequal pre-revolutionary economy that left most Cubans poor before any of this started. There was a revolution that delivered real gains in health and education, while also nationalizing the economy and restricting political freedoms. There was a U.S. embargo that has lasted over 60 years and clearly limited Cuba's access to trade, investment, and technology. There was a heavy dependence on the Soviet Union, followed by a catastrophic collapse when that support vanished. There was an economic system that, even independent of outside pressure, created strange incentives and chronic shortages. There was a second dependency on Venezuela, which also collapsed. There was a pandemic that crushed one of Cuba's last reliable income sources. And sitting quietly underneath nearly all of it, there was a military-run conglomerate controlling most of the foreign currency entering the island, with almost no public transparency about where that money actually goes. Rex thought about the meteor cave from before. About isolation. About debt. About dependency on a single benefactor. This story had pieces of all of them, stacked together in a different order, with one more name added at the bottom. Gary stood up slowly. He told Rex that with Cuba, unlike some other stories, the ending has not been written yet. The embargo could change. The government could change. GAESA could stay exactly as opaque as it has always been. Rex did not have a tidy conclusion this time. Neither did Gary. The story did not end. It just stopped, mid-sentence, the way real history usually does.